Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he is doing. He is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. C.S. Lewis. Exodus 19, 2-6. They set out from Rephidim, and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. How would you respond if someone asked you whether you were holy? Would you laugh? Would you deny such a claim? I think most of us would at least be taken aback by the question. But that's exactly what God desires you to be: holy. It's more than most of us have bargained for. We're fine with being just mere Christians. We have made ourselves out to be a quaint one-room cottage, when God is trying to build us into mansions in which he will live. We are content with being decent. He is determined to make us holy. When we think about being holy or pure, we usually think about it in negative terms, in terms of things to be taken away. We think about abstaining from all kinds of things. We consider being holy to be an act of removal, removing bad thoughts, angry words, foolish behavior, etc. But rarely have I found a person with the perspective of holiness adding something to our lives. That's one reason, I think, people are often hesitant to pursue holiness. They consider all the things they might have to give up, yet do not contemplate the fact that there is so much more to gain. We think, I'm going to have to give up watching my favorite show, or talking about people, or drinking my favorite drink. We don't think, I'm going to be made like God. Being made holy is not just a matter of getting rid of sin or impurity. It's being made righteous, being made clean, being made like God. And that's necessary for us if we want to be in the presence of God. See, in the beginning, there was intimacy between man and God. Humanity was ever in his presence and had no shame. They were able to be in his presence because they were in his image and likeness. They were holy as he is holy. Now we should understand the nature of God's holiness. Most of us consider the idea of God being holy as just a way to say that he's morally good and righteous, and that is a part of it. But it's so much more of a description of God's very nature. To be holy is to be utterly unique and separate, set apart from all other things. It's dangerous to come into the presence of God, because the purity of his holiness is such that any corruptible thing would be annihilated before him. Thus, when Moses came to look at the burning bush in the wilderness, God told him to keep his distance. In Exodus 3, 5, and 6, it says, "Then he said, 'Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground.' And he said, 'I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.' And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God." And again, when the presence of God filled the tabernacle, Moses was unable to enter. In Exodus 40:35, "And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." When the two sons of Aaron came into the presence of God inappropriately, they were destroyed. Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. "Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, laid incense on it, and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord." The holiness of God is dangerous, not because he is vindictive, but by its very nature. Consider the sun. It is 92.96 million miles away from the earth. Would you call that separated? Are you glad that we are separated from the sun? I'm sure you are, because you know that if we were too close, we would be burnt up. We don't think the sun is evil because of that. We simply understand that it's the nature of the sun to be dangerous. It's the same with God's holy presence. If you are not of his own nature, then you risk destruction by getting too close to him. You must be made pure and holy before coming to him who is pure and holy. Psalms 24, 3 through 4 says, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully." If the presence of God's holiness is dangerous, how is anyone supposed to get close to him? That's what the book of Leviticus is about. It may be a bit difficult to read, but the point of the book is to give the people detailed instructions on how to make themselves pure before the Lord so that they may enter into his presence. In there, we get all these instructions about avoiding contact with anything relating to death. God is a God of life, so anything relating to death makes one ritually impure before him. The same is true for eating certain animals and coming in contact with particular bodily fluids. It's not a sin to be unclean in these ways, but it is sinful to enter the presence of the Lord in that state of impurity. So they are given very precise instructions on how to make themselves ritually pure again, so they may enter into his presence. Leviticus 11, 44 through 45 says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." Here we have the idea that impurity is contagious, and it spreads to us by contact. That is why the Jews did not go into the house of a Gentile for fear of becoming unclean by contact. That is why lepers would cry out, "Unclean," so that people could avoid touching them. That is why women would have to be isolated during their time of the month or after childbirth. People tried avoiding contact with impurity so that they would not become impure. This becomes ingrained in the culture and the mindset of the people of Israel. The impure cannot enter the presence of God because they would contaminate his holy presence. If you touch an impure thing, it transfers its impurity to you. But the impurity of man goes deeper than just touching gross things and needing a bath. Mankind's unholiness is a matter of our nature. When Adam and Eve decided to reject the word of the Lord and to try and define good and evil for themselves, they broke the relationship between man and God. Genesis becomes a story about the descent of man into greater and greater darkness and impurity. Humanity is fundamentally corrupted by sin, and no matter how much ritual we perform, still our sinful nature remains. And Jeremiah calls the human heart deceitfully wicked in all its ways, and David declares that we are born into iniquity. If our very natures are corrupted, how can any of us ever enter the presence of the Lord? Well, that is the way Isaiah felt when he had a vision of the very throne room of God. In Isaiah chapter 6, 1-5, it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. When encountering the very presence of God, Isaiah became keenly aware of his own impurity and his lack of holiness. He was convinced that he was going to die. For that's what happened to those who entered the presence of God in an impure state. But something very interesting then happened to Isaiah in verses 6 and 7. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Now, Isaiah, who is admittedly impure and unholy before God, then touches something holy. Now, usually that would mean that his impurity would corrupt that holy thing, but the opposite happens. The holiness of the coal is instead transferred to him, cleansing him of all impurity and making him holy. Instead of being made holy before entering the presence of God, God's presence makes him holy. The prophet Ezekiel has a similar experience where he has a vision of the new temple of God, and from it is a trickle of water which gradually becomes a great river and eventually empties into the Dead Sea. And wherever the river goes, it brings life and turns the desert into a lush garden like Eden was. These are strange visions full of deep symbolism, and we don't really find out what this means until we are introduced to a man named Jesus. This man named Jesus comes onto the scene and claims to be the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets. All those rituals, feasts, holy days, sacrifices, purification rites, and laws are completed in him. Their purpose is fulfilled in his life. All those things which the prophets foretold are brought to their completion in this man. And he demonstrates this in a very real and tangible way. Just like the holy coal cleansed Isaiah from all impurity, so Jesus went about touching those who were considered impure and unclean. And instead of Christ becoming contaminated by these unclean people, his holiness made them clean. Matthew 8, 2-3. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will. Be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Matthew 9, 20-26 says, And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, If I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. Here we come to the part where his holiness really impacts you. You see, when Christ touched someone and made them clean and holy, it was not just to act as a temporary cleansing like the old rituals. Christ came and brought cleansing to our very nature. In Hebrews 9, 11-14. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? He infected us with holiness, and then turns and sends us out to infect others with his cleansing power. That stream flowing from the temple of God, bringing life to all the world, began with Christ, and its current is increased by those who come after him. He cleansed us, and now we in turn bring his salvation to others, spreading the infection of his holiness. Ezekiel's vision of the life-bringing river is fulfilled in Christ and in you and in I. John 7, 37-38. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. God desired that the Israelites would be a kingdom of priests, and he prepared them for it in Mount Sinai. If you remember back in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But they were afraid and could not come near him, and instead asked that another would go in their place. God still desires a people to be a holy nation. He still desires his presence to be among his people in all its purity and holiness, because of the redeeming and sanctifying work of Christ. You can now be that people. 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy.